if there is an issue ahead, there is a server. My mother doesn't know what a server is. She doesn't know a password or those kind of issues. Mr. Speaker, these laws also addresses the negligence of those officials of IBC, the presiding officers, the returning officers, those who are not going to sign or do their work diligently. So that in case you are a presiding officer, because, Mr. Speaker, there's so many errors. The Form 34, the Form 35, C's and B's, those which was pronounced at the Supreme Court, Mr. Speaker, that they were not signed. Actually, many of them, they were from the opposition side, Mr. Speaker. When they saw they lost, they called their people, they called their officers not to sign those forms, just to support them so that they can get a leeway. And the law which we are discussing today in this House, Mr. Speaker, is that when you are a presiding officer, when you are an election officer, you have a responsibility to this country and to there's so many millions of voters in this country. If you don't sign your form, if you don't stamp your form, if you don't do what is expected of you, you should carry the cross. What is wrong with that, Mr. Speaker? I think we need to have these people work responsibly. Mr. Speaker, we want to ask Kenyans outside there who are saying that we are rushing these laws. From this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, where I'm talking, we are supporting this bill. From this side of the House. We don't have a problem. So it is the right bill, Mr. Speaker, and we want to ask Kenyans to prepare themselves for the repeat of presidential elections come 26th next week, Mr. Speaker. And for those, Mr. Speaker, who are seeking to demonstrate, Mr. Speaker, which is also provided for in the Constitution, let them do their demonstration peacefully. Let them stop violence and destruction of properties, Mr. Speaker. Because as we speak, Mr. Speaker, there is no vacuum of leadership in this country. President Uhuru is still the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He's still the president of Kenya, Mr. Speaker. So we should not be carried, honorable members. This is legislature. We have the right to legislate any law. Like we don't direct the judiciary what they are supposed to do. So we don't expect anybody to tell what this House not to do and what to do, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to support this bill. I know there is I have even amendments, but when we go to the third reading of this bill, Mr. Speaker, we encourage members to bring amendments so that we make a law for posterity of this country and prosperity of this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I support.
Very well. And of course, Article 94, Clause 5 says that no person, body, has power to make provision having the force of law except Parliament. That is the Constitution, and does not say when it is you should do it. That does not tell you should do it in December or in January or February. So it is good, Honorable Kangogo, you have said it loudly, but I wanted it to be said by somebody else who I can see, the member representing who was in Yishu County, Honorable Gladys Sholei. The one.
You powered mine.
No.
Mine is working. It's working, yeah. Mr. Speaker, and fellow members, it's my pleasure to take the floor of this august House, not only to make remarks on the business at hand, which is the Electoral Amendment Bill 2017, but also to make my maiden speech, as is the parliamentary tradition. Mr. Speaker, I want to start by thanking the people of Uasin Gishu County, the home of champions, the source of champions, and the city of champions, for choosing me as their representative. I will endeavor to my utmost to articulate their issues and legislate in matters that are dear to their hearts. Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to be here in these chambers and would like to point out that indeed I have now served in all the three arms of government. I served at the executive as CEO of the National Council for Law Reporting, also as Deputy CEO at the Electoral Commission, and also at the Judiciary as Chief Registrar. And finally now in this National Assembly as a legislator. And on a light note, I can now say I'm a total public servant. Mr. Speaker, the import of this brief history is that I have interacted with electoral laws in various capacities and in various stages of my public service life. Mr. Speaker, I think at IIEC, then the Electoral Commission, which was formed after the 2007 election violence, and also as part of the recommendations by the Kriegler report, at that time we were able to run the first ever referendum in the history of Kenya, which gave birth to the current constitution. This was the first time that technology was used for biometric registration in that particular election. Honorable Mr. Speaker, in 2013, while at the Judiciary and as Chief Registrar, we handled the first presidential election petition under the new constitution, where incidentally the use of technology was also an issue in question before that court. Mr. Speaker, following the 2013 decision, Parliament made amendments to the electoral laws to cure the perceived shortcomings that were raised by the 2013 presidential election petition. Mr. Speaker, indeed at that time, the majority decision recognized that the amendments were necessary and that all these legislative enactments that needed to be undertaken were to ensure that in conformity to the Constitution, elections would be free and fair. Mr. Speaker, interestingly, we are here again, yet again to address perceived shortcomings in our laws that were raised by the 2017 presidential election petition in our courts. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to point out that review of laws in general and in principle shows a willingness to adapt and to new thinking and evolving situations. And hence the reason why I support these current amendments. If you remember and if we recall our history, Mr. Speaker, in 2007, the Kriegler report did make recommendations for electoral laws, new electoral laws. And at that time, our predecessors in this same parliament managed to pass a law establishing a new body called the IEBC, which exists today, that was supposed to manage elections. It also required IEBC to implement in electronic systems for managing, tallying, and sending the results, election results. Mr. Speaker, all these recommendations have largely been implemented by the Electoral Commission. The recommendations also of the Kriegler report did not only stop at election management. It included electoral dispute resolutions, and hence the reason why our predecessors in this parliament were able to pass legislation that put a statutory limit to the amount of time that you can hear an election petition, hence the limit to 6 months, which we are benefiting from today. Mr. Speaker, I wish to draw your attention to both the minority and majority decisions of the Supreme Court 2017 decision, which recommended that there has to be changes to our electoral decisions. And therefore, it is my hope that this House will approach this debate in a sober and a bipartisan manner. Mr. Speaker, I wish now to bring my attention to the amendments that are before us. The first amendment in relation to the position of the chair of the Electoral Commission. I must say I support this amendment because nature abhors a vacuum. So does the law, and thus it follows that public office abhors a vacuum. It is therefore in order to make amendments to ensure that that vacuum does not exist. If you all recall, more recently, when the Chief Justice, Dr. Mutunga, retired, the Vice Chair of the JSC was able to perform the duties of the Chair to ensure that there was no vacuum. It is therefore in order to have similar legislation in relation to the Electoral Commission. Mr. Speaker, the same goes to the powers given to the commissioners that would be acting as chair at that time. Mr. Speaker, if I may speak to one of the other amendments to Clause 5, which proposes to delete Section 29 of the Elections Act. This amendment is also pursuant to a court decision, the Gishira versus IEBC case, and therefore it is in order and should get all our support. Also, I wish to speak to another amendment, Clause number 6, which seeks to amend Section 39 of the Elections Act to provide for electronic transmission and physical delivery of the results to ensure that at any stage, any discrepancies detected are capable of being checked against the source documents, which is the police station, which is the final result. Mr. Speaker, I would like to state that the proposed amendments are not in any way meant to water down the constitutional principles of holding free and fair elections and transparent elections. Rather, the amendments are to anchor these principles in practice via statute. Mr. Speaker, legislative amendments to laws following a court decision are not unique to Kenya. All of us know that in the United States, congressional overruling of Supreme Court decisions is not particularly an exceptional event. It is therefore not for the first time that is happening in Kenya. And I hope that our international partners who are watching us should not make it look like it is only the Kenyan parliament that is making amendments following a decision. It happens all the time in the United States, and it is an ongoing tug of war between the Congress and the US Supreme Court. It occurs from time to time in the US, and the Congress may feel that they need to fill some of the gaps which in the court's opinion prevent improper interpretation, or sometimes actually to undo what we believe is imprudent precedent established by our courts. We are therefore in order, as this 11th Parliament, in making these amendments to these laws. Mr. Speaker, as a general proposition, this type of dialective intercourse between the court and the Congress is valuable and even creates friction because it checks the errors by each of the coordinate branches. Mr. Speaker, I will conclude by stating that I believe and support this amendment because it will only ensure that our future elections will be efficient, transparent, and thus living up to the constitutional thresholds of holding elections. I support the amendments. Thank you.
The member for Marakwet East talked about this side of the House. Member for Laikipia County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This afternoon, I'm glad to be contributing from the other side of the House, and I want to confirm to Kenyans that this side of the House is very sound, very vibrant, and excited about the amendments and the bill that is in front of the House this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, I want to confirm also to our dear Kenyans that there is nothing wrong as far as what I'm hearing the members from my side here complain, that the qualification of the chairman of the IEBC must be that of a judge of the High Court. Mr. Speaker, there was an opportunity that the members of opposition wanted to exploit by making sure that they do a demonstration and they do mob justice against one Wafula Chebukati and also Ezra Chiroba, which, Mr. Speaker, we must tame this afternoon by making sure that the powers that the chairman has can also be the same powers the vice chair can hold in the absence of chairman. So if anybody thought that by taking Ezra Chiroba or by taking Wafula Chebukati to the streets of Nairobi, we will create room for them to create a constitutional crisis, then we want to tell them they are very wrong, and that one is coming to an end this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, we also want to confirm that the quorum, there have been problems with the commissioners of IEBC. And for some reasons, Mr. Speaker, because I know there are some people who have been thinking that the chairman, if he has there are internal wrangles within the constitution, he will take advantage of some members by making sure they do not attain the necessary quorum. We are making sure that we are going to give them Warobaina this afternoon, and Mr. Speaker, the quorum shall be 3 members. Mr. Speaker, thirdly, we want to confirm to Kenyans that the role of the chairman, because yesterday you remember the lawyer who is representing the IEBC, the lawyer Paul Moita, Mr. Speaker, appeared before the Supreme Court asking for interpretation and clarity on the mandate of the chairman, Mr. Speaker, on that crucial day which is coming on 26th, Mr. Speaker. It is very clear, and from what the committee has done, Mr. Speaker, he will verify, and he is ready to address, and he should be ready to address discrepancies, Mr. Speaker, which would come up, Mr. Speaker, from the physical and digital transmission of the results, Mr. Speaker, which will be at the National Tallying Center. Mr. Speaker, we also want to address a challenge, Mr. Speaker, that made the IEBC to be taken to the court by the members of opposition on the live transmission of the results. We want to declare it is not into the interest of the government of Jubilee to deny any Kenyan citizen information which they feel it is a matter of importance to them and importance to the state. Mr. Speaker, we'll make sure that the IEBC, Mr. Speaker, they do their job and make sure we get live transmission of results as much as the county tallying center, Mr. Speaker, will be relaying results to the National Tallying Center manually. Mr. Speaker, it is an offense for anybody who is working for IEBC in the name of an officer or a presiding officer, Mr. Speaker, not to do their job willingly, or if money will be poured or has been poured or will ever been poured, Mr. Speaker, let anybody know that they will be taken capable of their own problems, and Mr. Speaker, this afternoon will make sure they will stay where they belong, because criminals, whether civil or whichever, Mr. Speaker, they have their special place where they should be put. Mr. Speaker, I also want to address the technicalities, Mr. Speaker, like what the committee has done that are in the clause 9, Mr. Speaker, which while addressing on the technicalities, Mr. Speaker, which made the Supreme Court to nullify the 8th general election, Mr. Speaker. We want to make sure that nobody, and especially the member of opposition, the members who are in the opposition, led by one, the former Prime Minister, Raila Odinga, will not get an opportunity to rush to the court, claiming that there were technicalities that he cannot prove, cannot ascertain, and claiming that we did not have a credible election, Mr. Speaker. And by the virtue of this bill, I want to confirm to Kenyans that once we pass this bill, we will make sure that anybody that takes the IEBC or the commission to the court must prove beyond reasonable doubt, Mr. Speaker, that they have got substance, which is credible, that can prove that there was non-compliance from the IEBC, Mr. Speaker. Finally, I want to concur with the members of the committee that looked into the petitions and the memoranda, Mr. Speaker, that were brought by the members of public. As we move forward, Mr. Speaker, we would want as Kenyans to make sure that the process is very simple, and also, Mr. Speaker, that will relate very well with the members of public without, Mr. Speaker, feeling that they are deprived of their right, and like they are deprived, Mr. Speaker, of the opportunity to know who is their authentic leader, Mr. Speaker, from the word that comes strongly from the ballot boxes, Mr. Speaker. I want to confirm to Kenyans that Kenya is safe, Kenya is stable, the IEBC Commission is on track, they know their job, they have no role but to do exactly what is stated from this august house and what has been passed by this house, Mr. Speaker. I also want to confirm to Kenyans that let nobody cheat you, that this law that you're about to pass, Mr. Speaker, will affect in any way the way IEBC are preparing to conduct the election that is coming on 26. I support, and we would request even the members who have absconded coming for a sitting this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, I understand some are very busy throwing blows at each other outside the parliament, Mr. Speaker. We want to tell them to come back, and if they need to fight, let's fight using our brain and our mouths and using the Constitution of Kenya. I support.
Member for Igembe North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to contribute to this good piece of law. Mr. Speaker, you remember the issues that we have been grappling with about the Supreme Court for the last nearly 2 months now. The country has been paralyzed, and in the process of paralyzing the country, we have managed to create a moment of crisis. And, Mr. Speaker, the element of crisis is not established in law. It is the political temperatures deliberately engineered to cause problems. Mr. Speaker, the same engineering is being called upon to visit the House when it comes to debating this law. Mr. Speaker, if you check on the issues that are being addressed by this piece of law, those who are fighting it are describing the story of timing. They do not say in any part of the legislation there is a problem. They are insisting that the timing is wrong. But they do not tell you when somebody went to the Supreme Court to seek the nullification of the presidential election, they had not anticipated to create a monumental problem like they have created for the country. Mr. Speaker, when the Supreme Court asked the country to go and prepare for a repeat in 60 days, Mr. Speaker, you have seen the mischief played. Instead of preparing for elections, we have had problems of people who do not want an election. And this is what has been bringing the country into confusion. Mr. Speaker, this should have been the most stable democracy in the world. After the September 1 ruling, everybody expected there to be chaos. There was no chaos. So, I have seen a lot of hypocrisy among the donors and among purported civil society who are not so civil nowadays to invite a moment of instability in a country which is not there. Mr. Speaker, if it was any other country in Africa in particular, there would have been bloodshed in the next 48 hours, which nobody would have come to stop. Mr. Speaker, we thank the institutions of this country, which are intact. Mr. Speaker, if you look at the stool, it has 3 legs, just like the state, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Mr. Speaker, the country can do without a judiciary for a moment. Mr. Speaker, the country can do without parliament, even for 4 years or 5 years. It cannot last without a president for 1 hour. Mr. Speaker, when we talk of the presidency, it is a confluence on which all the other institutions revolve around. And it is for this reason, Mr. Speaker, we should not take it casually. When somebody says that I went to the Supreme Court, got a ruling, and I may wish to withdraw. Mr. Speaker, the Constitution and the laws of this land are being addressed very well. When you go to a polling station, like the chairman of the ad hoc committee ably described, we had no problem. The problem came in when somebody went to court and they complained about the process. And this judge of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, put it very well. He said, we are not addressing an event. It is a process. Now this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, the country is invited to address the anomalies that might have been in that process. As of now, Mr. Speaker, the country cannot take results manually because the law prohibits us from doing so. Now, when we want to say that we need a simultaneous or an alternative method, Mr. Speaker, we should be able to get support of every Kenyan, even those from the other side of the House. Mr. Speaker, this country is for all of us. And as you've seen, the issues that we have been grappling around about the uncharted waters we have been going through, and we want to address it on the 26th. We do not want the story, Mr. Speaker, of a story of a returning officer of the presidential election who is so permanent and individualized that if he under flu or diarrhea that morning, we would not have anybody to announce the results of the presidential election. Mr. Speaker, the powers of the chairman of the Electoral Commission in the Constitution are clear. But we want to address, Mr. Speaker, the issue of a returning officer of the presidential election. There is nothing so judicious about the chairman of the Electoral Commission that it has to be an individual. It has been described like this. It can be a member of the IEBC who has been appointed by the others to stand in. And in this case, Mr. Speaker, in our succession tradition, in the IEBC, there is the name of our vice chairperson. So, Mr. Speaker, I do not see this single attachment to an individual to be the actual presiding officer, and in his absence, nobody else can be able to announce the results of the presidential election. Mr. Speaker, it is not done in any other place. These are the problems when you pass laws from the demonstrations and in the midst of tear gas. And this is what happened with this law, Mr. Speaker. People passed a law which does not have a succession clause. It passed a law which is suffocating in its own details. So, Mr. Speaker, this afternoon, we want to clarify that when the Electoral Commission does receive the results, the chairman should be able to announce the results. In his absence, the vice chairman or the vice chairperson, it doesn't have to be this unfair to a country to state the time is wrong. Time for what? 26th is coming. This is the right time. This is the time. This is the hour. These are the people. This is the National Assembly which should correct this, Mr. Speaker. We are not having a spare country where we can experiment with individuals. When an individual feels so possessed into an agenda that we don't have to care about the details of what is happening to our future and to our posterity. I heard somebody complaining, saying that the story of the economy doesn't arise. Mr. Speaker, we are having economic problems for the last 90 days or for the last 1 year because of political uncertainties. Mr. Speaker, when we want to reward the hard-working Kenyans, ask anybody who is in business, whatever you sell, whether it is food, whether it is service, whether it is petrol, nothing is working or adding up because of the political uncertainty arising out of a careless Supreme Court ruling that did not go into details of what they were putting the country into. We respect the ruling. But, Mr. Speaker, if you look carefully, they were not aware what they were driving us as a country into. They did not anticipate all the mischievous or the mischief of our leaders who don't care about the country, who are not patriotic. Because patriotism, Mr. Speaker, is an invitation to call to answer the call of duty for the country, not to the individual. So, Mr. Speaker, when we get into the issue of the candidates who want to withdraw from election, they think they can create a crisis. The Constitution and the law, Section 138, 139, and 140, they are very specific. They anticipate the absence of another candidate because of death, and they say what should happen. They don't anticipate mischief, malice, bad intentions, and bad manners of politicians. So, Mr. Speaker, as we address these clauses, the amendments this afternoon, we need to worry about our own country and say very clearly, we love it more than we love the individuals. Thank you.
Member for Kitutu Church North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me a chance to contribute this important motion. Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court ruled that our votes did not make any sense on the 8th of August, and that we must repeat the polls. They also ruled that those elections would